We're getting ready to go through an update on our standard system and the development that we've had over the last couple of years and where we are today. I just want to make sure I pause for a few seconds because I know people are still logging into the webinar, so giving time for them to join. Okay. So hello, I'm Laura Kohler and I'm heading up our standard system at Textile Exchange. And the webinar we have for everyone today is to give an update on our standards development, what we've been working on, known as the Unified Standard System, where we are today. I want to start with this Menti poll. Sorry about that. Let's take it back to the Menti poll. I think the slides advanced. Okay, thank you very much. So this is something that you can scan with your phone, or you can go into the web address that you see there and enter the code. This is information that is great for us to know about our stakeholders and who's joining the webinar to understand what part of the industry that you are representing as we go through the content. We'll also provide this again at the end, and this Menti is going to be open for 14 days. So actually people will have quite a bit of time if you just want to take note of the information there, and you can fill it in at a later time. And I'm going to move to letting you know who you're going to be hearing from today. So myself, I'm going to talk us through some background information so everybody knows what we're talking about. We have Anna Heaton joining to go through the more specific information that we want to share on what we've been doing with animal materials in our standard. And then Callie Weldon is going to join at the end. She's also helping Q&A as we go through the webinar slides, but at the end she'll also give some good updates on how more people can stay engaged on the process. In terms of how we're running questions and answers during this webinar, everybody is muted. So along the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a Q&A box. So don't get confused with the chat box. If you have a question, please go to the Q&A part, put your question there. We will be able to answer some questions in writing as we go through the content, and those will be shared with everyone. Some questions we will take live at the end, and that means that questions you've submitted in the box will answer live. And then there may be additional questions that we decide to save and respond to after the webinar. So we'll be sharing that out with all of the participants, everybody that's registered, to make sure everybody gets that equal access to the Q&A and the information. For the agenda, the first thing I would like to make sure everybody is aware of is we also conducted a similar webinar yesterday. The webinar yesterday was the full overview of where we are with what we've been developing in the Unified Standard System. So it had quite a bit more detail on the background information, the timeline that we're working against, and how to navigate the information that we posted online for people. So if you're feeling that you're kind of missing out on some details that you were hoping to get today, please know that we have the recording from yesterday that we will be sharing out. It will be available on our website as well. And when we share out the recording from this session, we'll provide a link to the session from yesterday. So I just want to make sure people know that there's a lot more detail in the one that was conducted yesterday. Today, we're spending more time focused on updates that have been happening with criteria related to animal fibers that we're working with in our standards. But otherwise, you can see on the agenda that we are going to do some of the brief background information on the standard development, and then close with an update on future engagement activities that we have planned. So setting the stage for everybody, setting the scene, the future standard system that we have been developing for the last 2 years or so, we have the overarching objectives, and that is the fact that today we have 7 different material specific standards. And we're bringing those into a harmonized system. So aligning how we're approaching criteria, how we're looking at outcomes, and in particular, focusing on our organizational strategy for climate and nature and the long-term impacts that we want to see on the ground related to our Climate Plus goal for 2030 in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, looking at how we can be working through a standards system and auditing practices to adjust our criteria with those outcomes as our focal point. So that's really been the bulk of the development that we've been doing on the criteria and that people have seen in the draft consultations that we held for the Unified Standard last year. So in 2023, we had 2 draft standard consultations. And what we're talking about today is the culmination of that work and where we are today. I wanted to also make sure that people know that as we take this look and close examination at our standard system, we're also thinking about what are the other pressures that we see in the industry and what we can be doing to future-proof our standard system as a whole. And one of the things I like to think about is just in the nature of sustainability standards. They've been around for about 30 years across different industries. And we've set the stage with these different sustainability standard systems in terms of how we're bringing different actors together within a particular industry and across the different stakeholders that are working or are interested in that industry or within the communities that organizations are sitting. And now we need to be looking towards this, how we keep that foundation moving into the future. And that really is related to climate, nature, and people, and ensuring that standard systems are driving outcomes and measuring and monitoring the effectiveness of the standard criteria in terms of delivering on those outcomes. So we are looking at our assurance model, how we're working with certification bodies, our third-party accreditation system that we have in place. We're looking at different contexts that our standards have been used in and where they're going in the future and making sure that the standard is staying relevant for those contexts. That includes the fact that different legislative actions and policies from governments have come into play in standards that had not been there previously. Our standard system is voluntary, but we need to be looking at where we have opportunities to align with government policy. So that's something else that we've been examining, and as well as the traceability mechanisms that supplement standard criteria. So how we're looking at volume reconciliation and the tracking of materials and other attributes related to certified materials. And then the last thing is the claims and labeling. So that's a big part of our standard development in terms of where we're going with the new standard system. Behind the scenes, we've been working on review of what policies relate to claims language, how we're communicating to consumers through certified material labeling, and making sure that we have that information in mind as we move forward with the new standard system. So I just wanted to make sure people are seeing the big picture with where we're going in the future, and then give more specific information about where we are today. And that includes the fact that with the recent publication of the standard criteria, we rolled out the new name. That's the Materials Matter Standard. So you've been seeing it. Of course, if you saw the notification about the new standard being published, then you will have seen the name and some of the information that we provided about the change in name. We've during last year, we tried to make sure that people knew that even though we had been saying Unified Standard, that was the holding name, while we had been working with a branding agency to review options for our new name and for our new logo. And the other important detail to just mention for people here is that we'll release the logo later this year. We'll do that with our conference. But for now, when you open up the documentation that we've provided, you will see the Materials Matter name. And I just want to make sure people are not confused by that because of being used to the Unified Standard name. And this is letting you all know where it's screenshots from our website in terms of where you can find this information online. I believe in the chat, the link to the web pages will be provided for you. So we've posted a new version of the standard, and that's a bit of what we're going to talk through today. This is called the pilot version 1.0. That is because we are using the criteria in the standard for pilot testing in the field. And I will share more information about what that means and what that means for this version of the standard. But for everybody to be aware, we have the complete set of criteria across all materials in the scope of the standard available online in a PDF document. We've also taken a subset of the criteria on a material by a material basis and have created those tailored versions. So that's what you see on the right side of the screen, is that we've have additional PDF versions available online. So if you want to focus in on alpaca, for example, you can go to that version of the standard, and that provides you with insight on the criteria that are applicable for alpaca instead of, maybe being also applicable to recycled materials. So it allows you to focus a bit more. Similar to what we had been doing with our 2 draft consultations last year, we had summary papers because the opening up the standard itself can be quite overwhelming. It's a lot of criteria, it's a lot of information. So we want to make sure that people know where to spend their time and energy in terms of getting into the content that's of most interest to them. So the summary papers help provide that snapshot. There's information on how to navigate the content of the standard, how to move around within the document itself. There's highlights on key changes for you to be aware of. And for this pilot version in particular, it helps people to understand how the criteria have evolved from our standards today to where the materials matter standard is going in the future. So you can get that insight when you look at the summary papers. So I'm going to briefly go through the scope and the timeline of the standard. And just as a reminder, like I mentioned, we had the much more in-depth webinar yesterday. So if you feel you're missing some details, definitely check out that content when we share the recording and slides from yesterday's session. But a reminder on the scope of the Materials Matter standard. What you'll see in the pilot version is our Tier 4 standard, which means it's the raw material production as well as first processing of those raw materials. And those are the areas that when we've looked at our criteria in terms of our climate and nature strategy, those impact areas are part of the Materials Matter standard at Tier 4. As that certified material leaves those operations and enters the rest of the supply chain for tiers 1 through 3, that's where our pre-existing content claim standard, or the CCS, picks up the chain of custody requirements for how the certified material is tracked and handled through the rest of the supply chain to bring that certified material into the final products that are sold to consumers. So that's what our future standards system looks like, having the clear differentiation between the Tier 4 and raw material processing that's happening, and then the rest of the supply chain and chain of custody. The impact areas that we've been working on that relate to the climate and nature strategy, you can see those on the left side of the screen. So this is where we have taken that closer examination over the last couple of years, where we started with charting out what are the long-term changes and impacts, the beneficial impacts that we want to see on the ground, and how do we back up from that in terms of looking at what are the outcomes that would be driving towards those long-term impacts, and what are the type of criteria and indicators that we feel deliver on those outcomes, and what are the kind of measurements that need to be taken and monitored to make sure that we're on the right track. That's the work that we've been doing that has resulted in the criteria. In some cases, that means we've looked at the criteria we have in our standards today and have adjusted those according to that future vision. And we've introduced also new criteria that we feel had been missing, that weren't going to really be, that we didn't have in place to deliver on the climate and nature strategy. So that is giving just a very brief insight on how we've been looking at the climate and nature strategy and how that relates to criteria in a standard that's driving outcomes. On the right side of the screen, you see the raw materials that we have in scope for the standard at Tier 4 and first processing. The majority of, well, all of the materials that we have today in our standards are included in the Materials Matter standard. So that's what you will see here. The ones that have the asterisk are additional materials that, as we set out in the beginning of this process, we recognized that these materials are integral to the climate and nature strategy as well. And we want to make sure that we're capturing those with that same mindset on the impact areas that we want to be driving the outcomes. The asterisk means that we've understood that there are other organizations that are already working in this space that have already developed standards that have participating organizations in those systems. So we don't want to come in and duplicate that work. We would rather look at opportunities to form partnerships with these organizations and be able to have that certified raw material enter the Materials Matter system for the rest of the supply chain. So that's a work in progress that we call our recognition framework. There will be more information that's shared later this year about the progress on recognition. It's something that will roll out at a sort of a later time frame than the bulk of the standard that you're seeing today. Because we've had different versions of the standard, I wanted to use this slide as a way to provide information on the timeline. So earlier this year, we went through the process of reviewing the feedback that we got on the second draft consultation that was held in the second half of 2023. We reviewed that feedback and developed the pilot version of the standard. So we developed the criteria that you all are seeing today. And we reviewed the criteria with our international working group and had approval to be able to release that version publicly. And so that's the work that was happening in up until March. We were getting our pilot testing underway in terms of organizing which pilots will happen earlier in the year and sharing the criteria to make sure people had that information in hand. And then that brought us to June, where we've done the public release of the pilot version of the standard. That's with the Materials Matter name. The reason we have another version listed here for October is because we'll add the logo and other branding elements when we go into the Textile Exchange annual conference towards the end of October. So the criteria will at that point still be the same, but the standard will be available with all of the branding included. Then as we move towards 2025, we are going to be using the insight that we get from different activities this year to refine the criteria and start to set that criteria for the final version of the standard. So the main things that I want to highlight here are the standard that's available today is intended for pilot testing. That's where we take the criteria out into the field under different contexts. I'll talk about what that means in a bit more detail later. But we want to use the learnings from the pilot testing activities as well as other policy updates that we're doing this year in order to get into more detail on the criteria in specific situations and be able to finalize the criteria and provide that published version during the middle of 2025. Then we need to use time for the second half of 2025 to allow all of the certified organizations, the certification bodies, everybody that's been participating in our standards today, they need to have time to fully digest and analyze and absorb where the criteria are finalized and what that means for their systems. What do they need to update and what type of training and templates, all of the different materials that people have that relate to how they demonstrate conformance or evaluate conformance as a certification body, all of those materials need to be updated. So we like to allow 6 months for that to transpire. So if we provide the published final version of the standard middle of 2025, that means that in the first quarter of 2026, we'll release, or the standard will become effective. And that means that it can start to be used for live audits happening in the field and for certificates to be issued against the standard. We also want to provide a bit of a buffer for people to not go immediately into mandatory. So we're again allowing another 6-month buffer. So we'll have that effective date where audits to the new standard are voluntary. And then middle of 2026 is when we're slating for the standard to become mandatory, which means that all certified organizations that have their previous standard replaced by the Materials Matter standard will need to have their next annual audit against the new criteria. So that's my verbal background of how this is working, but please know in the introduction to the pilot version of the standard and in the summary papers, we provide that in a lot more detail in terms of for you to be able to dig into those details and understand what that means in reality. And then, of course, we're happy to take questions to help guide people through that process. The last bit that I am going to talk about is the pilot testing, and that really is the crux of where we are today, the fact that we have a pilot version of the standard. That's so that we can get the criteria out into the field into different contexts, so looking at different materials, different regions, different organizations, talking to different stakeholders, and really doing a lot of ground truthing on the criteria. We've gotten a lot of feedback in the draft consultations and through other means. We know there's a lot of complex information that's been introduced in the criteria. So we want to be able to take time to understand, are the criteria the way that they're set in this version of the standard? Are they auditable? Are they feasible, realistic? So it's really that process of getting that feedback and using that to further refine the criteria. So this is giving just a bit more on the field testing is looking at that auditability and feasibility. It's looking at what is the required level of effort for conducting an audit, what's the required expertise of the auditor, and the cost benefit of how those things are coming together with the type of criteria that need to be in place to drive outcomes. So it's giving us a lot more insight in real on the ground situations to test that. We're also going to be looking at other tools and templates that support implementation of the standard. That means looking at audit checklist and data that's being collected, looking at our monitoring, evaluation, and learning system and the tools that we're using for that, the feasibility of data collection and the usefulness of that. So it's really giving us insight into the complete standard system that we are rolling out in the coming years. And the last bit on pilot testing that I want to share with everybody is the needs assessment that we've gone through and where we've identified the type of field visits that we want to be conducting. So you'll see here different materials and where in the world we will get on the ground and do this pilot testing. We're organizing this with certification bodies and with certified organizations. So we're really grateful for those who are participating in this. It's an incredibly valuable process to make sure we have a well-rounded standard. Not all of these are confirmed. They're all in discussion. But we did want to be able to share where we've identified the biggest needs to do this field testing. And then we'll share information as this process progresses. And with that, I am handing over to Anna to go through the more specific criteria updates for animal materials. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Laura. And yes, I've got a few slides here that are sort of across all animal materials. So that's the animal fibers and down. And then we're going to dig a bit more deeply into the specifics for animal fibers. So starting with the sort of overarching updates, which, as I say, sort of apply to any of the animal materials. So one of the key things which, for those of you that are working with the current responsible animal fiber standards, you'll know that we have standards documents and then we have separate user guidance. And you sometimes have to go between the two documents to really understand the intent behind a particular criterion. So with the Materials Matter standard, you'll see that there are details of the expectation for all of the different criteria that are included. This is the addition of, it's called intent and clarification. So it's adding this additional information within the standard, and that's informing both the farmer or grower and the auditor alike. So everybody is working from the same information to understand what are the key points that are being looked for those criteria. And as noted there, some of this will be familiar from the user manuals for responsible animal fibres and the responsible down standard, but some of it is also new. Another sort of key overarching update is the human rights and livelihood section. Here, I'm just noting that this section contains significantly more robust criteria and is aligned with globally recognised frameworks. There also a note here that smallholders do not have to achieve the same level of human rights and livelihood management as a larger commercial organisation. But I've got a bit more detail in a couple of slides' time, but for enough for now just to say this is a section that you'll see is quite different to what you're used to under current certification. And then another sort of change in terms of sort of overarching differences to the current responsible animal fibres and animal materials. The first stage processors, so for wool animal fibres, we'd be talking about scouring. At the moment, the requirements are through the content claim standard and are focused on the traceability of the certified material. And in the Materials Matter standard, this is now including first processing. So there are criteria around the human rights and livelihood and environmental management for that processing phase that will need to be met. It came up in some of our original reviews for the drafts of the Materials Matter standard that farmers and growers were concerned that this was going to get audited as part of the farm audit. This isn't. This is going to be separate for those first stage processes. And then another sort of overarching point is that, again, if you're used to our existing standards, include recommendations for best practice. These are now referred to as leadership criteria. And all the existing recommendations in the responsible animal fibre and responsible down standards were reviewed. And some have been proposed as new conformance-related requirements, so they're now things that have to be done rather than are simply recommended. And some new leadership criteria have been added. But the principle of having some criteria that demonstrate this is the best practice, this is the direction of travel, is something that is carried across from our existing standards into the Materials Matter standard. Also, for our animal materials, it's really key we recognise the 5 domains of animal welfare. We have started to do this in our latest revisions on the responsible animal fibres, but this is really the theme with which we've approached the Materials Matter standard. And there's more emphasis on requirements that should provide positive experiences for certified animals, rather than just focusing on the avoidance of negative welfare. This is also really a shift between focusing on the 5 freedoms, which are really about the avoidance of negative things happening, moving towards the 5 domains, where, as noted, this is more about how can we deliver positive outcomes. And then for land use, we've really looked at the land use sections within the lens of what are we looking at with our Climate Plus strategy, where we obviously include water, biodiversity and soil health. And it's really how does the standard help to feed into that vision? And again, more emphasis on the good outcomes rather than just the avoidance of the negative outcomes. And then now a bit more detail on that human rights and livelihoods section. So this is just sort of to give an idea of what's included. I mean, first of all, for those of you that are familiar with the Responsible Animal Fibre Standards, you'll be aware that there are social criteria, and all those key factors such as the avoidance of child labour, the avoidance of forced labour, the avoidance of discrimination, looking at health and safety for workers, all of those are still here. We haven't got rid of any of those, but as mentioned on the first overarching theme slide, is a greater level of detail that we're going into here. So here's some of the examples of things that are now included in human rights and livelihood. So there's requirements for policies and codes of conduct for respecting human rights. So an example would be grievance mechanisms that workers can access, and also looking in more detail at recruitment management and contracts for workers. There's also sections on labour rights. Again, some of these are familiar from Responsible Animal Fibres, but including as well working hours and pay, freedom of association and collective bargaining. And then the health and safety section has been expanded. This now includes things like first aid, equipment and training. So a focus here on social justice and the rights of Indigenous people and local communities who may be impacted by the activities leading to the production of certified materials. And then in terms of livelihoods, there's several leadership criterion, so basically recommendations, but really showing that the direction of travel should be working towards a living wage for everybody involved in the supply chains. I'm now going to go through some more specific details for animal fibres. So this is wool, mohair and alpaca. And I'll start with animal welfare and then look at land use. So for animal welfare, a lot of the criteria are going to be familiar to those of you who are already using or certified to the Responsible Animal Fibre Standards. So the different topics for the Materials Matter Standard, I'll now look at each of those in turn and highlight some key similarities and differences. So for health and welfare planning, there's obviously still requirements for this kind of planning to take place, but there's more details on the topics that need to be included in the plans. Then with nutrition, the requirements for good food and water still retained, but one point about the maximum amount of time off water that could be allowed has been adjusted for ewes and does in late pregnancy. And as you can see from the slide, this has been extended to a maximum of 20 hours, noting that this doesn't mean that all animals can be held off for that 20-hour period. It's timed from when a group of animals is removed from water until the last ewe is returned. And this is relevant around shearing, where the common practice is to hold animals overnight so that they are emptied of food and water before shearing, which has benefits for both the shearers and the animals in terms of as they're being moved around for the shearing process. And that 8 hours that was previously in the standard did not allow for that overnight period. So this has been extended. Moving into living environment, the recommended space allowances for housed or penned animals in the Responsible Animal Fibre Standards become requirements when animals are held for 24 hours or more. So if animals are just brought in for a short time, the overarching criteria that they must have freedom of movement remains, but there are specific requirements relevant to the type or size of animal that will kick in if animals need to be held in for longer periods. It's worth reminding here that the principle that all these fibre animals must be raised in pasture-based systems and only removed from pasture when it's to the benefit of their welfare, for example, when there might be a weather emergency or wildfires or something like that, that still remains as well. Protection from heat and cold stress has always been within our standards, but this becomes a major requirement. And there's more focus here in recognition that we've got changing climatic norms, that situations like droughts or floods that were once in 20 years or once in 50-year events are happening more and more frequently in some regions. So the planning to ensure that animal welfare is protected needs to take take this into consideration and might require different use of pastures with shelter at particular times of year to ensure that animals get this protection and their thermal comfort can be maintained. Going into the husbandry procedures, the requirements around common practices such as castration, which would go across the species, or tail docking for sheep. These criteria are the same as they are in responsible animal fibres in terms of the acceptable methods that can be used and the maximum age of animals. Obviously, mulesing remains a critical criterion with a prohibition. This is not permitted. On pain relief, there was a lot of discussion about this during the review phases for the Materials Matter Standard. We've actually retained what we already have in responsible animal fibres, that pain relief is required when suitable pain relief is available. And that means available to the farmer or grower to use. So it might need to be prescribed by a vet, but the farmer or grower needs to be able to use it themselves without having to have a vet come and administer the products to every single individual animal. This we had requests on both sides with this, that it was felt that at the moment we're putting a lot of pressure on our farmers and growers in Australia and New Zealand, where pain relief is certified, is currently licensed for use in sheep, and many other countries it's not licensed. But as noted here, that we're really heartened to see there's been improvements here. There have been products licensed for sheep in the UK, and it looks like there's also one coming in the United States as well. And we hope that this is something that will continue and more of these products will become available. So say for now, we know that some of our key production areas, for example, South Africa and parts of South America, we don't have these products available. So it's not it is a when available, it must be used. Moving on to shearing, this is the same criteria as from responsible animal fibres have come into the Materials Matter Standard, and these core criteria that a competent person must be carrying out shearing is still very important. For herd or for sheep, there'd be flock management. There is an avoidance of mixing certified animals to reduce potential aggression. This is one that came out of a criterion in the Responsible Animal Fibre Standards that said if you're mixing breeding males, you need to be really careful that there's not aggression, and you need to be monitoring that group to make sure that animals are not getting injured and have routes to get away from others. For the Materials Matter Standard, we've extended this to talk about mixing of any animals, because there is the potential for aggression when different stable groups are mixed together. And so we're stressing that you should be avoiding that, which would be normal practice anyway, to not keep mixing animals. There were a lot of comments here when we talked about avoiding mixing certified animals. People were concerned that we were prohibiting mixed species grazing, i.e. that we were saying you couldn't have sheep and cattle grazing together. And that's not the intent of this criterion. And this goes back to the point where we're talking about this additional information that used to be perhaps in the user manuals is now shown in the standard, hopefully makes that clear for anybody looking at the new standard. When we come to the breeding, birthing and caring for young animals, there's some changes around weaning age. First of all, the Responsible Animal Fibre Standard set a single minimum age at which animals had milk removed from their diets, were weaned, and regardless of whether those animals were being reared by their mothers or were having to be artificially reared for whatever reason. The Materials Matter Standard makes clear that the expectation is that animals will be reared by their mothers, but also understands that sometimes emergencies happen and animals will need to be artificially reared. And there are different criteria set there for the amount of time that milk needs to be the primary part of the diet, and at what ages animals can be removed. For lambs and kids reared by their mothers, this is now increased to 8 weeks under the Materials Matter Standard. It might be worth noting here that in draft 2, it was proposed that we went up to 12 weeks, but we had quite a lot of feedback that that would not be possible in all seasons, and that 8 weeks should be sufficient to ensure that the lambs and kids are well able to live on forage without reliance on their mothers. So this is a nice example of the review process in action and how we have responded to the comments that were made. In handling and transport, there's a new criteria promoting positive handling, building good relationship between animals and the workers that are looking after them. And really this emphasis on reduction of noise, low stress handling techniques, using perhaps visual aids such as flags rather than other means to move animals, like physically pushing them. But the prohibition on abuse and mistreatment also remains. And this is one example of looking at the 5 domains, where rather than just saying, let's avoid the bad things happening, it's also bringing in how can we make handling a more positive experience for the animals. Similarly to the space allowances that we talked about when animals have to be removed from pasture and placed into housing, the recommended space allowances in transport have been updated and they are now required as well. And the update makes these more applicable for particularly for sheep and goats to the size of animal, whereas previously it was done on more like the type of animal, and we knew that there could be quite a range of different sizes and weights within those types. So now setting it by the weight or size of the animal hopefully makes that a more relevant requirement. For euthanasia and on-farm slaughter, acceptable methods for euthanasia were added. The overarching requirement for euthanasia and on-farm slaughter, that the expectation is that where for on-farm slaughter always, and for euthanasia where possible, methods that where the animal is stunned and it remains unconscious until it dies, is bled and dies, remains the same. And for euthanasia, the allowance is that if the animal is in severe pain and suffering, and trying to access tools would just prolong the time taken to perhaps go back to the main farmyard, and access tools would be too long, that again is retained from the current responsible animal fibre standards, but some of the guidance that was in the user manuals is now more clearly in the standard. But we listed in the responsible animal fibres the methods that were acceptable for on-farm slaughter, but didn't so clearly do that for euthanasia. So that's now been added. And we've also updated the signs of death that must be observed. So this is an important part with euthanasia and on-farm slaughter, that the person carrying out this procedure must know how to observe to make sure that the method they've used has been effective. We also have the slaughterhouse module, and you'll have noted from Laura's slides that skins are now a material that are covered in the Materials Matter Standard. We actually have had a voluntary module in the responsible animal fibres for slaughterhouse, for those that might want to use the skins from certified animals as leather. And then in the Materials Matter Standard, this does still remain voluntary. But if you want to market skins from certified animals, then it must be followed. And I appreciate now, looking at this slide, that wording doesn't make that clear. But the overarching point that this is a voluntary add-on, but if you want to market skins, then it would be mandatory. I'm going to move across into land use now. And again, most of these criteria are going to be familiar to those certified to responsible animal fibres. So for the land management plans, the focus shifts to soil and land health rather than just land management. And as I was talking earlier about the shift to more accurately reflecting our goals under our climate strategy, and soil health being a key component of that, this is sort of aligning there. And there's, again, the same as we talked about with the animal health and welfare plans that we've provided more details on the topics that need to be included in this planning. The same's happened here for this soil and land health plan. And then for the specific section on soil health and monitoring, the requirements for monitoring land are retained, but there's more clarity on what are the soil health factors that we're looking for. The next section is soil nutrients. This was called fertilizers in the Responsible Animal Fibers Standard, but we recognize that there are more things than just fertilizers. There could be natural manures and compost being used as well. So looking at nutrients as a topic is sort of a better way to approach this subject. And then there was some recommendations about the use of buffer zones in responsible animal fibres. This is now coming in saying that there's a requirement that to avoid pollution, depending on what's being spread and where, buffer zones of varying widths would be needed to ensure that we're not causing problems with those water bodies when spreading right next to them. There's a pest management section, again, same as you see in the responsible animal fibres criterion. Again, this is as previous, this has emphasis on looking at integrated pest management and management to avoid pests being a problem before pesticides might be used. There are some new requirements for good storage, handling and application of chemicals, just to ensure that we are making sure this is covered. Again, these are things that were covered in the user manuals, but weren't specifically within the standard previously. There is a completely new section here in land use, and that's on water management, but it's aimed at those who are using irrigation. So this could be in animal fibres. We know that in some regions, people will have smaller areas where they're growing higher value forage crops that might be under irrigation. So this section's applicable there. And this looks at water management planning and records of water abstraction. So again, looking at water as being a really important resource and just being, this section's really sort of saying, how are we being mindful about the use of water and ensuring we're not depleting the sources that are available to us. And then the biodiversity section, there is again a biodiversity management plan, the same as we have in the Responsible Animal Fibre Standards, and again more details on the topics to be included. There's also a slight shift here with a focus on human-wildlife coexistence, whereas previously we talked about human-wildlife conflict. And it's not so much changing the individual criteria, but it's really putting the lens on how are we all working where possible to coexist with wildlife, rather than approaching this as a problem or a conflict that needs to be dealt with. There is a new allowance for poison to control invasive species, and I really want to stress that, but this is only when non-lethal methods fail and external experts agree this is the appropriate course of action. There was a lot of discussion about this in the review phase of the Materials Matter Standard, but we are aware that there's some real challenges with invasive species in regions where we're working, where there's a lot of fibre animals, and these are invasive species with no natural predators, and non-lethal methods were not managing to control the issue. And as obviously in the animal welfare section, we also have the requirement that certified animals need to be protected from predators. This is about the balance of where we can use non-lethal and where lethal is required. So I think now I'm going to hand over to Callie to talk about upcoming engagement activities. I think Claudia has already noted that if you have any questions and want any more details on these animal material sections, please note them in the Q&A. Thank you. Callie.
Thanks, Anna. We can go to the next slide. I just wanted to reiterate, we went over these slides yesterday. Oh, sorry, I forgot I'm in control. I'll go to the next slide. We went over these slides yesterday during the larger presentation, but I wanted to provide a little bit more detail and an opportunity for questions around this. We're really excited to be coming 2 different regions this summer in August and September to be able to meet in person with stakeholders. And we're planning some pretty big workshop engagement activities where we'll be renting some event space and hosting large audiences of up to 100 people per session for in-person engagement on these pilot versions of the standard. So we really want to be able to have this be a conversation as we roll out the different versions of the standard. To date, the drafts have been conversed about at conference and in various different settings with trips that the animals material team have done. But this is a really exciting time for us to bring different team members from across standards, animal materials team, the assurance team, stakeholder engagement to these regions where the standards are implemented, and to meet with producers to hear more about what the implementation process will look like and what the implications are and what the feedback on this pilot version really is. And this will be open to different types of stakeholders. So it will be available to producers, brokers, traders, different people at the beginning of the supply chain. So I have some dates here for upcoming webinars as well. And then the dates for the actual workshops are almost firmed up, but we're going to be announcing them in the coming weeks, and we'll send some individual emails out to invite everybody to these different regional pilot workshops. So we'll be visiting Peru for the alpaca producer network, Australia for wool, South Africa for mohair, and then New Zealand for wool. As well. And then we'll also have an Italy workshop that is focused on both textile to textile, but also wool recycled material in the supply network. So that'll be linked in with the animal fiber community via NFC this year. And then we do have a couple of upcoming webinars. We have an animal fiber webinar in Spanish. So if anybody wants to join that as well, it'll be the same content as this webinar, but in the Spanish language. And then we're also going to be hosting one for the Oceania time zone. So if you're listening back to this recording and you're in that time zone at a later date, you can register to come to a live session and be able to ask questions there as well. So I think that is all from me. And yeah, thank you, Laura, for also mentioning the recycled materials dedicated webinar. And so we're going to jump into Q&A. We've had one question come through on the skins part of the materials scope that was answered. If you do have additional questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Now we have a pretty good amount of time, about 8 minutes for questions and answers. And we have Anna and Laura who can both talk to anything people are wondering. So feel free to put them in the question and answer box. Nothing coming through just yet. We can also mention that we are going to be doing a more in-depth session on the criteria that Anna was talking through. We're still trying to figure out exactly what the best format for that is. So if it's in person at the workshops that we're hosting or online virtually, but it'll be a time for implementers or people who are going forth to implement this with different producer networks and farmers to be able to really dig into the details of the criteria. So more to come on that. We do have one question that came through and it's on the pilot. So I think this would be a question for you, Laura. So it's as the pilots for animal materials are in progress, are they still open for stakeholder participation, or kind of what is the process of choosing pilot partners for the pilot activities?
Yeah, so because it could be addressing a couple different aspects of the pilot testing. So I believe we have most participants set in terms of certified organizations that are being visited for the pilots, but it is possible to still reach out and let us know if you're interested in case some of those end up, if for scheduling purposes don't work out quite. So it is great to hear from certified organizations if you do want to participate. If it's meaning having other additional stakeholders on site during the actual field testing, that's not something that we're opening up for a variety of stakeholders to come and join. We already have quite a few individuals that come from the certification body and from Textile Exchange, and of course the organization that we're visiting in the field. But the workshops that Callie talked through is the other opportunity for when we are in some of those regions to have other stakeholders in the region be able to come and share feedback on the criteria and learn a bit more on some of the more specific sections of the standard applicable in that region or material.
That's all we have for now. So if questions keep trickling in, we can plug the Menti one more time. I'll leave it up on the screen here. We are really interested to know where you're coming from, what sector you're coming from, and it will be helpful as we then take this information and start to plan engagement activities for the summer and into the fall as well. But I don't see any other questions coming in through the chat. So do you want to close this out, Laura?
Yeah, Callie, I have a question for you, for everyone. So if people do, like, for example, what I mentioned about if there are additional organizations interested in the pilot testing or just other questions come to mind after these webinars, the best way for people to get in touch is what?
Yeah, so I think many people on the call have direct connections with the animal materials team, and so that's always a way to go through Anna or Siobhan who are on the call, and then they can connect in with the standards team if it is directly related to the Materials Matter standard, but then also standards@textileexchange.org, and we can bring in whoever's needed to help answer the question, and we can put that in the chat as well.
Great, thanks. Then yeah, thanks for the questions that have come through. I know yesterday, because we had quite a bit more dense content to get through, we actually didn't have time at the end for Q&A, and we did get a lot of great questions. So we are going to be putting that information together to share out with everybody. The recordings and the slide decks and the Q&A come about 1 week after these webinars are happening. So just be on the lookout for that. And otherwise, we really appreciate how much people have been participating in this process. Having stakeholder engagement across different groups is really important and integral to making sure that we have the criteria set in the best possible way. So hearing from you, even just your questions, is really insightful for us. Thank you. I see, Anna, maybe you wanted to also say something in closing.
No, it's just really, you captured it, Laura. It was just that thanks to everybody who has provided so much great information as we've gone through this process. And yes, just really appreciating everybody who's done that.
Great. Thank you.